Amid the chaos of the hospital, the renowned Dr. Karen humiliates the nurse, unaware that the patient whose presence is about to turn the tables is none other than Snoop Dogg, a twist that will change everything. The scream tore through the operating room, silencing the rhythmic beeping of machines that had preceded it. Dr. Victoria Hastings froze mid-procedure, her gloved hands hovering over the patient, as all eyes turned toward the source of the disruption. "Stop!" The word cut through the stunned silence like a knife. At the edge of the surgical team stood Maya Johnson, her face flushed with determination beneath her surgical mask. She clutched a medical chart in one hand, while the other gestured urgently at the patient's vitals monitor. "His pressure's dropping. That's not the right procedure for this complication," she declared, her voice carrying effortlessly across the now silent room. "And I can prove it." The surgical team collectively held their breath. Victoria felt her chest constrict, as though the sterile space, ironically one she had considered her personal kingdom, was suddenly airless. Her gaze locked with Maya's, crossed the operating table, and in that moment something passed between them that the others couldn't see. Recognition. Dr. Winters, the anesthesiologist, recovered first. "Dr. Hastings knows what she's doing," he said with forced calm, but Maya was already moving toward the patient, her movements deliberate and precise. "The arterial connection is compromised. We need to release the clamp and reassess before continuing," she continued, her voice steady despite the shock rippling through the room at a nurse challenging the hospital's most revered surgeon. Victoria's fingers tightened around her instruments, her knuckles whitening beneath her gloves. Her reputation, the culmination of 20 years of unchallenged authority, hung suspended between them. "This is outrageous," Victoria hissed, her blue eyes flashing with indignation. "Know your place." As another nurse shifted uncomfortably, Maya found her voice growing stronger. "With all due respect, Doctor, my place is advocating for this patient." A murmur ran through the team. Dr. Winters turned to Victoria, eyebrows raised in silent question, but the vitals monitor's increasingly urgent beeping made the situation clear. Something was wrong. Victoria's smile was razor-thin beneath her mask as she fought to maintain control. "Nurse Johnson, if you interrupt my procedure again, I'll have you permanently removed from my OR." Maya didn't back down. "The patient is in distress. We need to adjust our approach now." She turned to the surgical resident. "The literature on this exact complication was just updated last month. The traditional approach Dr. Hastings is using has been shown to increase mortality by 38%. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as she glanced at the monitor and saw the truth in the numbers. But 20 years of being unquestionably right made admitting error nearly impossible. "Release the clamp," Maya urged, her voice softening slightly. "Please." What happened next would forever change the dynamics of Lakeside Memorial Hospital in Chicago. 3 months earlier, Maya Johnson had been a nobody. A brilliant nobody, but a nobody nonetheless. At 34, she had just transferred to Lakeside Memorial as a senior surgical nurse, leaving behind a smaller hospital in Michigan to pursue opportunities in a more prestigious setting. Her slender frame and thoughtful manner made her easy to overlook in the hospital hierarchy. But behind her warm brown eyes lay a mind that constantly processed medical information in ways that sometimes surpassed the doctors she supported. Her greatest fear wasn't incompetence, it was being silenced. The possibility that her knowledge might never benefit patients because of hospital politics and rigid hierarchies. Dr. Victoria Hastings, on the other hand, had been Lakeside's undisputed star for over a decade. At 52, the celebrated cardiothoracic surgeon ruled her department with intimidating precision and unapologetic authority. With perfectly maintained blonde hair and a perpetually stern expression, she carried herself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been successfully challenged. She feared nothing more than losing control, the erosion of her authority, the questioning of her judgment, the suggestion that someone else might know better. They might never have connected if not for the Chicago blizzard of January 2024, which had trapped them both overnight in the hospital, Maya reviewing recent medical journals in the break room, Victoria completing paperwork for a groundbreaking procedure she'd performed that afternoon. "That approach is already outdated," Maya had said, breaking hours of silence between the only two people left on the surgical floor. "The Jensen method has been modified to reduce post-operative complications." Victoria had looked up, startled both by the voice and by the nurse's presumption in critiquing surgical methods. "Excuse me?" Maya had approached then, uninvited, and pointed to the procedure notes. The longitudinal studies, published last month, showed that this technique increases recovery time by nearly 30%. There's a new approach that maintains efficacy while reducing patient trauma. Victoria had bristled initially, but something in Maya's matter-of-fact analysis made her pause. "You're Johnson, right? The new transfer from Michigan?" She nodded, and rather than retreating as she normally might when the formidable Dr. Hastings acknowledged her, she pulled up a chair. "I've been following the research closely," she said, reaching for her tablet. "The modifications are subtle, but significant." That night, as snow piled against the windows of the hospital, Maya had shared her insights, a comprehensive understanding of recent advances that somehow hadn't reached Victoria's radar. The research was compelling, the application potentially revolutionary for patient outcomes. Victoria had listened, initially skeptical, but gradually intrigued, not just by the information, but by the transformation in Maya herself, how passion had turned the quiet nurse into a force of nature, her eyes bright with the fever of genuine concern for patient care. "This could change our approach entirely," Victoria had admitted finally. "This could improve outcomes significantly." What she didn't say was how threatened she felt by this nurse, who seemed to know things she didn't. The opportunity to reassert dominance had presented itself easily. Maya had been assigned to different rotations for the next few weeks. By the time she returned to Victoria's service, the surgeon had already implemented several of the techniques they'd discussed, presented as her own insights during department meetings, with no mention of the night shift conversation with a newly transferred nurse. She told herself it was just hospital politics, that in medicine knowledge was fluid by nature, that she had refined the concepts, made them implementation ready, that a nurse would never have had the authority or credibility to introduce new surgical approaches anyway. But deep down, Victoria knew what she had done. She had seen a potential challenge to her authority and neutralized it, regardless of who deserved credit. "I said release the clamp," Maya repeated, her voice drawing Victoria back to the crisis unfolding in the OR. "We need to reassess the arterial connection before proceeding." She turned to address the team now, many of whom were exchanging uncertain glances, caught between hospital hierarchy and the undeniable warning signs from the patient's monitors. "The latest research confirms this approach carries unnecessary risks," Maya continued, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'm not questioning Dr. Hastings' skill. I'm advocating for updated methodology." Victoria felt every eye shift to her, awaiting her response. Among them was Dr. Winters, whose furrowed brow suggested he was weighing Maya's words carefully. Dr. Winters leaned toward the surgeon. "Victoria, maybe we should consider—" "I don't need suggestions from nursing staff," Victoria snapped, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as the monitor's beeping grew more urgent. Maya reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded journal abstract. "The evidence is clear, doctor, and right now this patient doesn't have time for us to debate professional boundaries." The OR fell silent except for the increasingly alarming monitor. Victoria felt sweat beading at her temples despite the room's cool temperature. She had a choice now: maintain her authority and potentially harm the patient, or acknowledge that someone else, a nurse no less, might be right. As if reading her thoughts, Maya's expression softened momentarily. "I'm not trying to undermine you, Dr. Hastings," she said quietly. "I care about this patient's outcome, just like you do." That was when Victoria realized the corner she had painted herself into. She had dismissed Maya because she thought a nurse should never question a surgeon. Looking at her now, knowledgeable, prepared, and committed to patient welfare above professional hierarchy, she understood how dangerous her pride had become. With a sharp intake of breath, Victoria nodded once. "Release the clamp. Let's reassess." The relief that washed through the room was palpable. Within minutes, they had identified the problem, adjusted their approach using the technique Maya had suggested, and stabilized the patient. As they closed, Victoria felt something unfamiliar, the bitter taste of having to share credit, mixed with the unsettling realization that her knowledge might not be as current as she'd believed. The aftermath unfolded with the relentless momentum of a hospital rumor mill. By the next morning, word had spread that Nurse Johnson had corrected the great Dr. Hastings in the OR. Victoria's careful attempts to frame it as a collaborative adjustment satisfied no one. Surgical residents began approaching Maya with questions they once would have only asked attending physicians. Even the chief of surgery called Victoria into his office for a discussion about current best practices. But it was Victoria's response that truly sent shockwaves through Lakeside Memorial. Rather than acknowledge Maya's contribution, she began a systematic campaign to discredit her. Patient assignments were suddenly changed, keeping Maya away from interesting cases. Documentation errors, real or imagined, were highlighted and formally reprimanded. Comments about nurses who don't understand their role peppered Victoria's conversations with colleagues. Maya found herself increasingly isolated, assigned to the most mundane cases, and subtly excluded from team discussions. The message was clear: challenge Dr. Hastings, and your life becomes unbearable. "She's trying to drive you out," observed Tina, another nurse who had witnessed the changing dynamics. "You embarrassed her, and Victoria Hastings never forgets." Maya had known there would be consequences, but the systematic nature of Victoria's retaliation surprised even her. She had naively believed that patient welfare would ultimately matter more than ego. "I can't just back down," Maya said, though doubt had begun to creep into her voice. "What happens the next time a patient's at risk because no one dares to speak up?" The situation might have continued its downward spiral if not for the most unexpected ally, Calvin Cortazar Broadus Jr. How better known to the world as Snoop Dogg, the renowned rapper had been admitted for a minor procedure, nothing serious but requiring overnight observation. Assigned to the VIP floor, he had nonetheless noticed the tension during Maya's rounds. "Something heavy on your mind, nurse?" he'd asked during her evening check of his vitals. Perhaps it was his laid-back demeanor, or perhaps Maya had simply reached her breaking point, but she found herself sharing a carefully anonymized version of her situation. "So basically," Snoop summarized, "you saved someone's life with your knowledge, and instead of thanks, you're getting pushed out." Maya nodded, immediately regretting her unprofessional confession. Snoop leaned back against his pillows, expression thoughtful. "You know what that sounds like? Sounds like someone's afraid of your light." "My light?" "Your knowledge, your confidence, your willingness to stand up for what's right." He gestured casually. "People who are secure don't try to dim other people's lights. They only do that when they're scared their own isn't bright enough." That conversation marked a turning point for Maya. Rather than shrinking under Victoria's systematic pressure, she began documenting everything: the reassignments, the exclusions, the unnecessary reprimands. She didn't know what she would do with this information, but Snoop's words had rekindled her determination. What she didn't expect was for Snoop Dogg himself to take action. The day after his discharge, the hospital administration received a substantial donation offer from the Snoop Youth Football League Foundation, with one condition: the establishment of a patient advocacy program that would include cross-disciplinary training on speaking up about patient safety concerns, regardless of hospital hierarchy. The chief of surgery, Dr. Ellington, was thrilled by the potential donation. Victoria was less enthusiastic when she learned who would head the program. "Nurse Johnson?" she repeated incredulously during the department meeting. "Surely someone with more experience." "Ms. Johnson was specifically recommended," Dr. Ellington interrupted. "Apparently she made quite an impression on Mr. Broadus during his stay." Victoria's face had paled visibly. "This is highly irregular. So is a 7-figure donation earmarked for patient safety, Dr. Ellington countered. The board has already approved it. 6 months later, Maya stood at the podium in Lakeside Memorial's auditorium, addressing the hospital's first Patient Safety Summit. The program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations, with hospitals across Chicago now sending staff to learn the collaborative approach that had become known informally as the Lakeside model. Much had changed in those months. The rigid hierarchies that had defined Lakeside were gradually evolving into more collaborative relationships. Nurses and residents were increasingly comfortable raising concerns, knowing they would be heard rather than silenced. Victoria Hastings had initially been the program's most vocal critic, but something unexpected had happened during the first mandatory training session she'd attended with barely concealed disdain. A case study had been presented, anonymized but recognizable to Victoria as the very operation where Maya had challenged her. As attendees discussed what could have been done differently, Victoria had remained silent, arms crossed defensively, until a young resident had hesitantly offered, "Maybe the surgeon should have been more current on the research." "No," Maya had interrupted, surprising everyone. "The issue wasn't knowledge. The surgeon in this case is brilliant and highly skilled. The problem was a culture that made it difficult for different team members to contribute their perspectives." Victoria had looked up, meeting Maya's gaze with confusion. "Medicine is collaborative by nature," Maya had continued. "No single person can stay current on everything. What matters is creating an environment where everyone feels responsible for speaking up and safe doing so." It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement of Victoria's skill and value that she hadn't expected from someone she'd treated so poorly. After the session, Victoria had approached Maya in the hallway. No apology was offered. That would have been too much to expect, but a tentative truce began to form. "The Jensen modification you mentioned during the blizzard," Victoria said stiffly. "I've been implementing it consistently. The outcomes are significantly improved." It was as close to a thank you as Victoria Hastings had ever come. Now, as Maya concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, she spotted Victoria in the back row. The surgeon didn't applaud, but she did offer a slight nod of acknowledgement before slipping out. Progress of a sort. Outside the auditorium, Maya found Snoop Dogg waiting, his lanky frame casually propped against the wall. His visit to check on his program had caused quite a stir throughout the hospital. "Look at you," he said with a grin. "Changing the whole system." Maya smiled. "It's a start. Still plenty of Dr. Hastings types out there." "Yeah, but now they see you." Snoop straightened up. "That's what I told you, right? Don't let nobody dim your light." As they walked toward the cafeteria where a reception awaited, Maya reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She had feared being silenced and had found her voice. Victoria had feared losing control and was slowly learning that authority could be shared without being diminished. The hospital corridors, once battlegrounds of rigid hierarchy, were gradually becoming spaces where different kinds of knowledge and expertise could echo and amplify each other rather than compete. And somewhere in the hospital, patients were receiving better care because one nurse had refused to be silent,